The first time I realized my life had quietly turned into a reality show nobody warned me about. I was standing in the lobby of the Grand Mariner Hotel, wearing a black blazer that didn't quite fit, holding a folder with my name embossed in gold. That folder was supposed to represent power, legacy, the kind of thing people fight over in glossy courtroom dramas. Instead, it felt like a prop in someone else's play. The lobby was everything my grandfather loved: marble floors that looked like frozen waves, brass railings polished to a soft glow, chandeliers that didn't just hang but floated like they had opinions. Around me, staff moved with the calm precision of people who knew the building was a living thing, a pulse, a reputation. And then he walked in. My mother's new husband, Richard, the kind of man who collected confidence the way other people collect stamps, too many, too loudly, and mostly to show off. He strolled in as if he'd personally invented luxury. Before I could even take a full breath, he was already shaking hands, calling people by their first names, like he'd raised them, smiling his neat little smile that somehow made your skin itch. Then came the moment that still makes me laugh in that dry, exhausted way people laugh right before they cry. He asked me, right there under the chandelier, if I knew where the staff entrance was. Not as a joke, not as a mix-up. He said it as if it were apparent I was lost, like I was a visitor who'd wandered in from the street. Imagine being handed a kingdom in a folder, only to be mistaken for the janitor 5 seconds later. Life has a sense of humor, huh? But that humiliation, that awkward public shrinking of me in my own inheritance, that was the spark. The part where the camera zooms in and the narrator says, "You think this is the low point? Just wait, because the truth is I wasn't always that unsure kid clutching a gold folder like it might bite. I wasn't always the afterthought in my own family story to understand why." Richard felt comfortable taking control of a $50 million hotel empire that had my blood in the foundation. You have to understand who my grandfather was, who my mother was, and who I was trying to become in the space between them. So let's rewind. Let's go back to before the will, before the lobby, before Richard ever learned to pronounce Mariner like he owned the place. Back to when my grandfather's hands were still strong enough to build a throne, and my mother's fear was intense enough to give it away. Welcome, story lovers. From where are you watching from? Drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. I grew up in the shadow of a man who didn't believe in shadows. My grandfather, Elias Hart, was this self-made kind, the kind you read about in airport biographies. He was all grit and polish at once. Born in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in coastal Maine. He'd learned early that comfort wasn't a gift the world handed you. It was something you stole back with both hands. He started as a bellhop at 16. Not because it was glamorous, but because hotels were temples of possibility to him. They were where strangers arrived one way and left another. He watched businessmen with briefcases, honeymooners with soft laughter, tired families with hopeful eyes. And he thought if a building could hold all that change, maybe a person could too. He worked through school, through hunger, through the kind of tired that doesn't leave your bones. By 30, he'd saved enough to buy a failing inn with peeling paint and a for sale sign that had been sunbaked into surrender. Most people saw a wreck. He saw a beginning. The funny thing about my grandfather's story is that it was never just about money. It was about proving something to a world that had told him he'd stay small forever. Hotels became his love language. Each renovation was a statement. We can be more than we were yesterday by the time I was born. He owned 3 coastal properties. By the time I hit middle school, those 3 had become a network. By the time I graduated high school, there were 9 hotels under Hart Hospitality, each with its own soul and staff who spoke of Elias as if he were a weather system stormy at times, but life-giving. You'd think that kind of success would make a family steady. It didn't, because my mother Dana grew up inside his ambition the way some kids grow up inside churches. It was loud. It was constant. And it didn't ask permission. He loved her, absolutely. But he didn't always know how to be soft. Love from Elias came in expectations, in opportunities. in tough advice wrapped like bricks. My mother learned to be strong, but she also learned to be scared of failing him, and I learned to read the air in a room as if it were a second language. When I was little, Grandpa sometimes picked me up from school. He'd sit in the car in a suit that smelled like cedar and espresso, tapping the steering wheel, waiting for me. I'd get in and he'd ask about my day, but his eyes would always flick back toward the hotel across the street. He never stopped working, even in silence. He was proud of me in this calm, heavy way. Like pride wasn't fireworks, but a foundation poured under your feet. Still, there was distance. Not cruelty, just a lot of gravity. The night everything really changed wasn't dramatic on the surface. No sirens, no shouting. Just a phone call on a Tuesday. Grandpa had a stroke. I was 19. Freshman year of college, still trying on adulthood, like a coat that felt too big. My mother's voice on the phone sounded like someone had knocked the wind out of her. She didn't cry. She just went quiet. He survived. He recovered enough to talk, to stroll, to sit in his favorite leather chair staring at paperwork as if willpower alone could knit his body back whole. But he wasn't the same. He tired easily. He forgot small things sometimes. His temper shortened like a fuse that had gotten damp. He hated needing help. The staff noticed. The investors noticed. The hotels were still shining. But the man who'd kept them shining was suddenly human. That's when the vultures started circling. And I don't even mean strangers. My mother panicked in ways she never admitted. She'd grown up watching her father be unbreakable, watching him bend the world. Seeing him fragile terrified her in that fear. She started leaning on Richard. Richard had been around for a while, orbiting the edges of our lives as my mom's friend. Smooth, helpful, always there with a hand on her back and a solution to every hypothetical problem. He wore sympathy like perfume. People mistook it for kindness. He owned a small chain of budget motels in another state. Nothing impressive, but enough to make him sound like he belonged in our world. He talked about streamlining operations and modernizing leadership. My mother listened because she was tired, because fear makes even sharp people reach for easy answers. I didn't trust him from day one, not because he was evil in some cartoonish way. It was subtler. He was the kind of person who never asked questions unless he already knew the answer. The kind who walked into a room and immediately made it about him without saying a word. The type that smiled too much when Grandpa struggled to find a name. Still, I was young. I didn't have the authority to say much. And honestly, part of me didn't want to believe I might need to. I tried to focus on school. Tried to be normal. But one weekend home turned into another and another. Grandpa needed help with emails, with schedules, with reading contracts because his left eye still blurs sometimes. So, I learned the business by accident. I sat at the dining table with spreadsheets when other college kids were out at parties. I drove with him to properties so he could feel the ground. I watched him negotiate with suppliers and defend his employees as if they were family. I watched how he treated the housekeeping staff with the same respect he gave investors. How he remembered birthdays. How he left handwritten notes when someone lost a parent. Hotels weren't just buildings to him. They were ecosystems of people. It wasn't about owning rooms. It was about sheltering lives. Those months bonded us in a way we'd never managed before. The distance shrank. He started telling me stories of his childhood I'd never heard. The kind of stories that weren't in magazines. The ones about being hungry and ashamed and stubborn enough to survive anyway. And I started to see his dream not as a heavy mantle, but as something alive. Something I could love too, which is why the second stroke. A year later felt like the world slamming a door. This one was worse. It took him weeks to give his speech. He fought back slowly. But a new truth settled in the halls of hard hospitality. Elias didn't have forever. The board started whispering. The lawyers began asking about succession. My mother started making decisions in private, and Richard started showing up more. Asterisk at first. He was helping, then he was advising. Then he was attending meetings. And like a weed, you don't notice until it owns the garden. He was suddenly everywhere. That's how the ground got soft under our feet. Not with a sudden earthquake, with quiet erosion. The will was supposed to be simple. Everyone said Grandpa had thought it through. He hated meannesses. He hated family drama. He used to joke that a good legacy wasn't just what you left behind. It was how few people you left fighting over it. So when he passed peacefully, in his sleep on a bright October morning, the grief was a tidal wave. But there was also this strange, calm expectation. Like the next step was already written. Asterisk. We gathered at his lawyer's office 3 days after the funeral. The conference room smelled like coffee and old paper. Outside the window, the city moved like nothing had happened, which felt rude. I remember sitting on the edge of my chair, my hands pressed together, trying to keep my body from moving. My mother looked like a statue. Pale, upright, distant. Richard sat beside her in a tailored suit, his arm draped behind her chair, a posture meant to say, protect her. It looked more like possession. The lawyer read the will. I heard the words in a blur at first, like my ears were underwater. Then it landed. Grandpa had left the controlling share of hospitality to me. Not my mother. Not the board, me. He'd set up a trust to ensure the properties stayed together and weren't sold off piecemeal. He'd named me the beneficiary, primary heir, future owner, the one he believed should shepherd what he'd built. There were clauses about training and transitional oversight, sure. He was practical. But the heart of it was clear. He chose me, and I didn't even have time to process the honor before Richard's energy shifted in the room. Like a shark catching blood, the lawyer explained that because I was 21, still in school, a temporary administrator would manage day-to-day operations until I formally assumed control. And just like that, Richard volunteered, not officially in that moment, but in the weeks after. He was there with my mother, signing necessary documents. He was there at meetings I wasn't invited to because I was too busy with school, charming the board members who barely knew me. He was there telling staff we're all one family now. By the time I came home for winter break, it was as if I'd inherited a house and someone else had moved in and rearranged the furniture. I walked into the flagship property and found new policies on employee breaks, new vendors that somehow all traced back to Richard's friends, renovation budgets that looked inflated, like someone had taken Grandpa's careful numbers and shoved them up a staircase. I asked questions. I got smiles in response. Soft, condescending ones. The kind that said, honey, you don't understand adult things yet. They called it protecting me. They framed it as kindness. I should focus on college. I should enjoy being young. I shouldn't stress myself with corporate headaches. But here's what protection looks like when it's really control. The person helping becomes the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper becomes the voice in the room. The voice in the room becomes the one holding the keys. And if you're not careful, you become a polite guest in your own inheritance, Richard started, using phrases Grandpa had never used. Synergy, brand, pivot, profit extraction. He talked about the hotels the way someone talks about a stock portfolio, not a breathing community. Worse, he had my mother's complete trust. She'd been so scared after Grandpa's health declined that she was clinging to the first raft that offered stability. Richard knew that. He played that like an instrument. The board liked him because he was loud and confident and spoke their language of margins. The staff tolerated him because they had rent to pay. My mother defended him because admitting she'd been wrong would mean admitting she was afraid. And I was stuck. People don't really talk about the loneliness of being underestimated. It's not just insulting. It's disorienting. Like reality is being edited while you're still living it. I tried to fight it first. Tried to attend meetings. Tried to ask for financial statements. I was told to request them through Richard. I tried to speak directly to the CFO, a man Grandpa had hired 20 years ago. I was told he now reports to the administrator. I asked to be added to email chains about renovation. Decisions I was forwarded. Summaries after the decisions were already made. I'd never felt small around Grandpa, even when he was stern. He challenged me, but he saw me. Richard didn't see me at all. He saw a placeholder, a legal obstacle. A kid he could outmaneuver. The tension crept into my relationship with my mother. She'd sigh, tired, and say I was making things more complicated than they needed to be. She told me Richard was only trying to help. She told me Grandpa would have wanted peace. That sentence nearly broke me, because I knew Grandpa. I knew the man who built a 9-hotel empire from a dying inn wasn't allergic to conflict. He didn't worship peace. He worshiped integrity, so I started doing what he taught me to do, even when he hadn't said it out loud. I watched. I learned. I kept notes. I found old files he'd kept, handwritten ledgers, original vendor agreements, budgets with his scribbled comments in the margins. I compared them to the new numbers Richard was pushing through. A pattern formed. Profits were dipping even though occupancy was strong. Renovation costs were rising without corresponding improvements. Vendors were multiplying like rabbits. I wasn't a seasoned executive yet, but I wasn't clueless either. And Grandpa had quietly trained me for this without either of us realizing. Still, evidence isn't power until people believe it. And Richard had made sure no. One believed me. He started implying to the board that I was emotional. He told staff I was grieving poorly. He hinted that I might sell the properties and blow the money. He smiled in meetings where I wasn't invited and planted narratives like seeds. You know what's wild? How easy it is for people to believe the loudest voice when you're quiet by nature. But grief has a way of burning down the part of you that tolerates disrespect. Each day Richard played king in Grandpa's kingdom. Something in me hardened. I stopped asking for permission. I started digging. There's a moment in every long fight where you realize waiting for fairness is the same as surrendering. For me, that moment came at a quarterly board meeting I wasn't invited to. Not because it was secret, but because Richard had decided I wasn't ready. Found out about it from an assistant who still called me. Ilyas's girl with a kind of loyalty that felt like a warm blanket, so I showed up anyway. I walked into that boardroom wearing the same black blazer from the lobby scene, except this time it fit better because I'd stopped shrinking inside it. The room went quiet, the way people do when the unexpected walks in. I saw surprise, annoyance, a few pitying looks. Richard's eyes narrowed just a little, then widened into that practiced smile. I didn't wait for an introduction. I didn't wait for his permission. I sat down. On the table in front of me was a folder thicker than the one from the will reading. Heavier for different reasons. I'd spent weeks assembling it with the help of 2 staffers. Grandpa trusted and a forensic accountant I hired quietly out of my own savings. Every number was checked. Every vendor is traced. Every suspicious payment is tagged out because when you're trying to topple someone who's already holding the microphone, you don't bring feelings. You bring receipts. Richard tried to steer the meeting away from me. I let him talk. Let him perform. Let him paint his rosy version of brand progress. Then I opened the folder. I walked them through the numbers calmly, like Grandpa used to. I showed them the vendor trail leading to companies owned by Richard's cousin. I showed inflated invoices for renovations that never happened. I showed salary bonuses that had quietly appeared under administrative overhead. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I just laid the truth down like steel. At first, people blinked as if waking up. Then heads started turning toward Richard. Then the CFO, the one who'd avoided my calls, began flipping the pages faster. Richard laughed in that brittle way. People laugh when they think laughter can erase math. He tried to call it a misunderstanding. He wanted to call it my grief talking. But one thing numbers don't do is care about your excuses. The board asked questions. Real ones. Uncomfortable ones. And for the first time since Grandpa's death, Richard didn't have an easy answer ready. Somebody suggested a formal audit. Richard's smile finally cracked, and when it did, the room felt different. Like oxygen returned. He tried to push back, to remind them he was the administrator, to imply I was disruptive. But administrators are temporary. Owners are not. I reminded them of that, not harshly. Just as a fact, the vote to suspend his control wasn't immediate. Boards love procedure, but the investigation opened right there. Bank accounts were frozen within 48 hours. Vendors were reviewed. Staff were interviewed. The fraud wasn't a maybe anymore. It was a storm you could see on the horizon. Richard left that meeting still wearing his expensive suit, still holding his chin up. But the walkout was different. It was the walk of someone whose spell had broken, and I sat there in the quiet after, shaking not with fear but with the strange adrenaline of finally being visible. Dear audience, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps. The investigation took months. Betrayals like that don't unravel quickly. Richard tried to fight it through lawyers at first, then through public sympathy, then through my mother. That part hurt more than anything. She didn't want to believe it. Not because she loved his money, because believing it meant admitting she'd handed her father's legacy to a con artist. It meant admitting she'd ignored her own child. There were days I thought our relationship might not survive it. But the truth is persistent. It doesn't need you to like it. It just waits until you're ready to face it. The auditors confirmed everything. Richard had siphoned millions through fake vendors and padded contracts. He'd tried to position himself to either buy out the hotels with their own money or force a sale he could profit from. The board removed him officially. Charges followed. He disappeared from our lives faster than he'd arrived. My mother went quiet for a while. Then one night she sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, and let herself fall apart. No speeches, no dramatic apologies, just the raw realization of how fear had blinded her. I didn't throw it in her face. I couldn't. Not after everything. Not after losing Grandpa. Not after seeing how grief twists people. We rebuilt slowly, like restoring a hotel wing after a flood. Room by room, conversation by conversation. Heart Hospitality also needed rebuilding. Not because the properties were ruined, they weren't. Grandpa had built sturdy bones, but morale had taken hits. Trust had frayed, so I did the opposite of what Richard did. I listened, I met with staff. Not in conference rooms, but in break rooms, kitchens, and housekeeping closets. I asked what they needed. I wondered what Grandpa had done right and where he'd left gaps. I brought back vendors who'd been pushed out. I renegotiated contracts. I rehired employees who'd quit under Richard's pressure. Then I did something Grandpa never got to do because he was always racing forward. I paused. I took a year after college to work inside each hotel, not as a CEO in a glass office. As a learner, I shadowed front desk managers. I ran linens with housekeeping. I sat with maintenance crews at 6 a.m. listening to what the building had to say. Some people found that weird. CEOs don't mop floors, but Grandpa had taught me that leadership isn't height, it's depth. You can't call something yours if you don't know how it breathes. Over time, the hotel stabilized. Profits returned. Not because we squeezed people, because we respected them. Guests noticed. Staff felt safe again. Word spread. The board offered to make me a figurehead if I wanted. They said I could hire an executive team and step back. I laughed, because if this whole mess taught me anything, it's that legacy doesn't stay clean on its own. If you don't guard it, someone else will rewrite it. So I stepped in fully 2 years later. Heart Hospitality opened its 10th property in a city Grandpa had wanted to expand to. We named the main ballroom after him, not out of nostalgia, but out of gratitude. On opening night, I stood in that ballroom watching staff glide between tables, watching guests laugh, watching my mother smile in a way I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't revenge that felt good. It was alignment. It was feeling like the story had clicked back into place. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories every week. People love to say money changes you, but that's not really true. Money doesn't change you. It reveals you. It amplifies what was already there. Richard didn't become greedy because of the hotels. He was greedy to begin with and saw a chance. My mother didn't become weak. She became scared and grabbed for safety in the wrong place. I didn't become strong overnight. I'd been learning strength in Grandpa's shadow for years. I just hadn't needed to use it yet. Legacy is a weird thing. It's not just what you inherit. It's what you decide to protect, okay? Even when protecting it costs you comfort. If I'd stayed quiet, Richard would have drained Heart Hospitality dry. And everyone would have called it unfortunate timing. A decent man getting old. A young heir not ready. A company that lost its edge. That's how history gets rewritten, by people who count on your silence. So what's the real takeaway here? It could be that being underestimated isn't the same as being powerless. It could be that fear makes people hand over keys they should never let go of. It could be that the quiet kid in the room is sometimes the only one watching. What matters? And here's the twist that still gives me chills. After everything had settled, the lawyer who handled Grandpa's estate invited me back to his office. He handed me a thin envelope I'd never seen before, one Grandpa had asked him to give me only after I'd taken control for real. Inside was a letter in Grandpa's handwriting, shaky but clear. He wrote that he'd suspected Richard was angling for the empire even before the first stroke. He wrote that he'd left it to me not just because he loved me, but because he trusted my spine. He wrote that the trust clause requiring an administrator was a test and intentional trap to reveal anyone who tried to grab what wasn't theirs. Grandpa had anticipated the betrayal, and he'd built a safety net one didn't even know existed. So when people ask me now how I pulled it off, how I fought a man twice my age with twice my confidence, I think of that letter. I wasn't alone. He was gone. But he was still protecting us, still teaching me, still saying without saying it, "You've got this." So let me ask you something. What legacy are you protecting in your own life? What quiet fight are you carrying that nobody sees yet? And who might be underestimating you right now only because they don't know what you're made of? Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and new videos.